France, November 1944. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. It wasn't falling anymore. It was simply part of the air, thick and endless, clinging to everything like grief. The road to the front was little more than a ribbon of mud, chewed apart by tanks and trucks. Along that road crawled a convoy of U.S. Army transports, their engines coughing through the downpour. Inside one of them, silence reigned. Not the silence of discipline, the silence of men who had already died once. They were supposed to be in hospitals, or at home, or under white crosses in some quiet field. Instead, they sat shoulder to shoulder in the back of a rattling GMC, faces hidden in shadow, bandages yellowed with time. The youngest was missing both legs. The oldest, both eyes. One man had a steel brace where his jaw used to be. Another had no right hand, just a carved wooden stump wrapped in duct tape. Every face was different, but the eyes that remained, were the same. Empty, calm, unafraid. Someone coughed. The sound echoed against the metal walls like a small explosion. The driver shouted something through the rain. Nobody answered. Then the man nearest the door, his face half burned, muttered a single word. Front. At the head of the convoy sat a jeep with a single officer inside. Captain David Reed, 38 years old, former infantry commander. Lost his left arm in Sicily when a shell tore through his command post. They'd told him his war was over. He'd told them to go to hell. The prosthetic he wore now, a steel hook polished dull from use, gleamed faintly as he shifted gears. The convoy reached the outskirts of a ruined village. The map called it Saint-Vrain, though it was barely that anymore. Just broken stone and wet ash. Smoke rose from what used to be a church. Reed stopped the jeep, climbed out, and stood in the mud while the trucks rolled in behind him. He watched as the men dismounted, some limping, some crawling, some using sticks for canes. To an outsider, it looked grotesque. A parade of ghosts, a freak show of war. But to Reed, it was the finest unit he'd ever seen. Every man here had already faced death and come back. The army had labeled them non-deployable, psychologically unstable, physically unfit. Reed had seen something else. Endurance. The kind that doesn't break when the body does. He'd gathered them one by one from hospitals and rehabilitation camps across England. Some volunteered, some just followed. Officially, they didn't exist. No unit designation, no flag, no patch. Unofficially, they called themselves Reed's Rejections. The Germans would give them another name soon enough. "Welcome to Saint-Vrain," Reed said, raising his voice over the rain. "We're not here for glory. We're here because the 117th broke, and someone needs to hold this road." He pointed toward the fog-covered ridge to the north. "If the Krauts get through there, they'll hit the 29th from behind. That can't happen. You understand?" A few nods, a grunt. One man, Corporal Ellis, missing his tongue, lifted his hand and signed the word "understood." Reed nodded back. "Good. Dig in." They moved with strange efficiency. The blind men carried ammunition by touch, counting steps from truck to trench. The deaf worked the radio, oblivious to the screaming static. The one-armed set up sandbags using their knees and stumps. Every weakness had become a skill. Every scar a lesson learned in pain. By nightfall, the ridge was alive again. Broken, crooked, but alive. They named it the Hill of Misfits. In the darkness, Reed sat with his second-in-command, Sergeant Joe Kovacs, who wore an eye patch and walked with a cane. Kovacs lit a cigarette and said, "You know they're going to call this suicide." Reed didn't look up. "It's only suicide if we fail. And if we don't, then maybe they'll stop calling us broken." Lightning cracked across the horizon, revealing the distant silhouettes of German armor, dark shapes moving like ghosts through the rain. The sound came a moment later, low and rolling. Reed watched the line of headlights weaving through the fog. "They're coming." Kovacs spat into the mud. "How many?" "Enough." He turned to his men, his patchwork army. Some were praying, others cleaning rifles by feel alone. One soldier with no right leg was dragging himself toward his position with a Browning machine gun balanced across his lap. Another, blind in one eye, was carving something into the stock of his rifle. We came back. Reed walked among them, the hook on his arm clinking against the wet metal of helmets. "Listen up," he said. "We hold until dawn. No retreat, no surrender. You all know what it's like to lose something. Tonight, you make them feel it too." A murmur rippled through the line. Not cheers, just acknowledgement. Acceptance. The first shells fell minutes later. The ground shook and mud sprayed into the trenches. Shrapnel hissed through the air. Reed ducked instinctively, felt the sting of rain and dirt. When the bombardment stopped, there was a pause. The kind of silence that comes before everything changes. Then came the sound of engines. Dozens, maybe hundreds. German half-tracks rolled out of the fog, followed by infantry in gray raincoats. Reed raised his binoculars. The lenses cracked. He lowered them again. "Open fire!" The night erupted. Machine guns rattled, mortars belched, rifles cracked like breaking bones. The broken men of Saint-Vrain fought like machines built out of pain and memory. The blind gunner, Private Holbrook, fired by sound alone, tracking the clank of enemy treads. Corporal Ellis, the mute, relayed orders through gestures and touch. Sergeant Kovacs called out targets through his one good eye until his voice went hoarse. They weren't supposed to win. They weren't even supposed to be there. But by midnight, the German advance had stalled. Reed looked down the line, silhouettes lit by fire and lightning, twisted shapes moving through smoke. To anyone else, it would have looked monstrous. To him, it looked like hope. He whispered to himself, "The broken are the ones who bend the least." The rain kept falling, washing the blood from the trenches, blurring the line between mud and flesh, life and death. Somewhere, far behind the lines, an American officer asked his radio operator for a status report on Saint-Vrain. The reply crackled through the static. "The 117th's gone, sir, but something's still fighting there." He frowned. "What unit?" The operator hesitated. "No idea, sir. They don't sound like any unit I've heard." That was the night the legend began. The night the enemy first met the soldiers who were supposed to be finished. The night the Broken Battalion returned to war. England, 6 months earlier. Spring of 1944. Before the invasion, before the legend, there was the waiting. The war had turned the English countryside into a patchwork of barracks, tents, and convalescent hospitals. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like rain. Behind barbed wire and sandbags, the forgotten soldiers of America gathered, not by choice, but by order. The army called it the rehabilitation sector, but everyone else called it the graveyard. Rows of white huts filled with men who no longer fit the uniform. They were missing pieces, eyes, limbs, voices, sometimes sanity. Some wore glass eyes that didn't quite match. Some had faces stitched like patchwork quilts. Others stared out the windows, seeing nothing, remembering everything. They were the ones left behind. Captain David Reed had been there for almost a year. The stump of his left arm still ached where nerves remembered what the body had lost. He'd been declared unfit for command and transferred to light duty, training logistics officers. He spent his mornings giving lectures no one listened to, and his nights walking among the beds of the broken. He'd seen every kind of wound. The physical ones healed fastest. The others, the invisible fractures behind the eyes, never did. Some of the men tried to drown them with morphine. Others stared through the walls like prisoners of memory. Reed recognized the look because he wore it too. One night, a nurse named Ellen found him sitting in the ward, staring at a young soldier with his legs amputated above the knee. "Captain," she said softly, "you can't save them all." Reed looked up, eyes hollow. "That's what I used to tell myself before Sicily." She folded her arms. "You think you're helping them by sitting here?" "No," he said. "I'm reminding myself what's left to fight for." 2 weeks later, a memo came down from headquarters. Non-deployable personnel to be reassigned or discharged. Reed read it 3 times. Then he folded it and slid it into his pocket. That night, he gathered the men who still had the will to move. There were 12 at first. Amputees, burn victims, men with shattered hearing or speech. They met in a maintenance shed behind the hospital, lit only by a single hanging bulb. Reed stood before them. "You all know what the army thinks of us," he said. "They think we're finished, spent, dead weight. They're wrong." A man with a steel plate across his jaw spat on the floor. "And what are we supposed to do, sir? March on Berlin with crutches?" Reed didn't flinch. "If that's what it takes." He lifted his prosthetic arm. The steel hook gleamed under the light. "This isn't a handicap. It's proof that I've already survived what kills most men. So have you. I'm not asking for heroes. I'm asking for men who refuse to be forgotten." For a long time, nobody spoke. Then from the back, a low voice said, "When do we start?" Over the next few months, the group grew. Rumors spread through the rehab sector about a captain who was forming his own company from the discarded. Men who hadn't stood in months began practicing balance. Those who had lost arms learned to shoot left-handed. The blind learned to move by sound. A mute, Sergeant Ellis, began teaching battlefield signals with hand gestures. The doctors called it madness. The officers called it insubordination. Reed called it resurrection. He requisitioned supplies under false names, rifles marked for scrapping, ammo crates listed as educational material. They're trained in secret, in the rain, in the mud, behind the hospital fences. The locals thought they were ghosts, and maybe they were. Men pulled back from the grave by sheer defiance. Private Joe Kovacs joined them last, a one-eyed sergeant with a limp. He'd been a sniper before a mortar took out half his platoon and his sight. When Reed asked why he wanted in, Kovacs said, "Because I hate sitting still." Reed smiled. "Then you'll fit right in." They trained without ranks, without expectation. Their only rule: no pity, no excuses. When one man fell, another carried him. When one couldn't aim, another became his eyes. When one couldn't hear, he watched the others' faces. Piece by piece, they began to move as one, a machine of scars and willpower. At first, the army ignored them. Then someone complained. A colonel arrived to shut them down. He watched one of their sessions. A one-armed rifleman reloading using his teeth. A deaf soldier timing mortar drops by vibration in the ground. When it was over, the colonel said, "Captain Reed, what in God's name are you building here?" Reed answered, "A reminder that the war isn't over until every man stops fighting." The colonel stared at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "If you get them killed, it's on you." Reed nodded. "It already is." By the summer of '44, while the rest of the army prepared for D-Day, Reed's unit had a new name, whispered behind closed doors, unrecorded on paper. The Broken Battalion. They weren't supposed to deploy, but the invasion changed everything. The front lines chewed through men faster than replacements could arrive. Command needed bodies. Reed gave them his. On a grey morning in late June, a truck came to the rehab sector. The driver asked for cargo, not passengers. Reed handed him a list of 12 names. None of them were on the army roster. The driver frowned. "Never heard of these guys." "You will," Reed said. They loaded in silence, crutches clattering, prosthetics squeaking, breath clouds mixing with diesel smoke. As the truck rolled away, the nurse Ellen watched from the gate, tears mixing with rain. Reed turned once, raised his hook in a half salute. She didn't wave back. The truck disappeared down the road toward Dover, and with it went the men no one wanted. The army never logged their departure. No orders were filed. Officially, they never left England. But by the time the paperwork caught up, they were already across the Channel, heading for a war that had tried to erase them. That was how it began, not with glory, but with absence. The absence of everything that made a man whole. And yet, somehow, they were still soldiers. The camp was nothing more than an abandoned airfield near the southern coast of England. Concrete runways cracked with weeds, hangars stripped bare, roofs half collapsed. The army had written it off as useless, which made it perfect. No one came asking questions there. No one reported noises or gunfire, or the ghosts of men trying to become soldiers again. Captain Reed stood on the tarmac that first morning, the wind tugging at his coat. Behind him, his dozen recruits assembled in a crooked line, uneven, mismatched, but standing. It looked like a parody of discipline. One man leaned on crutches, another had a patch over both eyes. A third was missing half his face, teeth gleaming through skin grafts. But Reed didn't see their flaws. He saw their patterns, strengths hidden in weakness, potential buried under scar tissue. "All right," he said. "We start over. You were soldiers once. You will be again." The one-eyed sniper, Sergeant Joe Kovac, barked out a laugh. "What are we gonna do, sir? March to Berlin with sticks and spare parts?" Reed turned to him. "No. We're going to show them what's left when you take everything else away." Their first week was chaos. Guns dropped, limbs failed, tempers exploded. One man with a prosthetic leg fell face first into the mud and refused to get up. Reed knelt beside him and said quietly, "Then crawl. You don't need legs to move. Just will." The man crawled until his hands bled. By nightfall, he was standing again. Reed built the training program from scratch. No marching drills, no perfect formations. Every exercise was designed around what the men had, not what they'd lost. The blind soldier, Private Holbrook, learned to shoot by sound, counting the echo between bursts. A deaf artilleryman named Hughes built a signaling system from flashes and hand movements, timing mortar drops with vibrations in the ground. The mute, Corporal Ellis, became the unit's silent commander, teaching everyone how to communicate without words. When one man couldn't pull a trigger, another pulled it for him. When one couldn't aim, another became his eyes. They learned to operate as a single body, wounded, limping, and lethal. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't by the book. But it worked. By the third week, Reed noticed something change. The self-pity began to fade. The jokes returned. Dark, rough-edged humor. The kind that keeps men alive. When Private Mason, a burn victim with no ears, missed a target, Kovac shouted, "Try using what's left of your face!" Mason grinned, raised his rifle again, and hit dead center. They laughed until it hurt. Reed didn't stop them. He knew laughter was armor. At night, when the wind died, the camp came alive with noise. The metallic click of prosthetics, the thud of crutches, the rasp of breath from lungs still scarred by gas or fire. They sounded like machines being rebuilt, and in a way, that's exactly what they were. One evening, after another day of relentless drills, Reed called them into the hangar. Inside, under the flickering light of a single bulb, stood an old chalkboard. Across it, Reed had written 3 words: no pity, no excuses, no defeat. He pointed at the words with his steel hook. You will forget pain. You will forget what they told you you couldn't do. The only thing that matters is that you move forward. Always forward. Understand? They answered not with words, but by slamming rifle butts into the floor. 12 heavy thuds, echoing through the hangar like the heartbeat of something reborn. From that day, they stopped being patients. They started being a unit. Weeks passed. Rain came and went. Reed submitted falsified reports to command, claiming the airfield was being decommissioned. In reality, the Broken Battalion was becoming something the regular army didn't have. Soldiers who fought not for orders, but for redemption. One day, a jeep arrived unannounced. Out stepped Colonel Whitmore, the same officer who'd once threatened to shut them down. He walked the line, saying nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he pointed at one of the men, a soldier with both legs missing who was manning a .30 caliber Browning on a tripod. You can't even walk, Whitmore said. How the hell do you plan to fight? The soldier grinned. Sir, I don't run from Germans. I wait for them. The colonel stared at him, then turned to Reed. You realize if this gets out, they'll call you insane. Reed shrugged. They already do. Whitmore hesitated, then said, The front's burning holes through our lines in France. If you're going to be crazy, Captain, be useful about it. And just like that, it was done. An unofficial approval. No paperwork, no orders, just a nod. They trained harder after that. Rifles were replaced with live ammunition. Reed led them through simulated trench assaults, live grenades, and ambushes in the fog. Every man learned not just to fight, but to think differently. Holbrook, the blind gunner, could now hit moving targets by counting his shots and adjusting by the sound of the ricochet. The one-armed Sergeant Keller had rigged a reloading mechanism using a wire loop and his teeth. Hughes, the death man, became their lookout. He could feel artillery through the soles of his boots before anyone else heard it. By late August, the Broken Battalion moved like a shadow. Fast, silent, unpredictable. Reed stood on the runway one evening, watching them drill as the sun set behind the hangars. The light cut through the dust, turning everything gold. Kovac limped up beside him. "You really think they'll let us fight?" he asked. Reed's jaw tightened. "No. That's why we'll just show up anyway." He looked down at his men, bent, battered silhouettes against the dying light. "You know," he said quietly, "the Germans think they've seen hell. They haven't met us yet." That night, a transport order arrived. Blank, unsigned. Destination, France. Reed didn't ask who sent it. He just smiled. The next morning, as dawn broke over the ruined airfield, the Broken Battalion rolled out in 2 trucks with no insignia. No flags, no fanfare. Just silence and the smell of oil and rain. They weren't part of any army. They were what was left when the army ran out of men. And in a few weeks, the world would remember their name, even if the records never would. France, October 1944. The front lines were chaos. Rivers turned to mud, forests turned to graves. The weather had broken, and so had the men. But still, the orders came down the wire. Hold the road to Saint-Vrain at all costs. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was desperation. When the Broken Battalion arrived, even the regular troops stared. They looked like survivors of another war entirely. Bandaged faces, missing limbs, eyes gone white with burns. Someone muttered, "Christ, what circus did they crawl out of?" Reed ignored it. He simply stepped down from the jeep, rain glinting off his steel hook, and said, "We're here to hold what's left." The command post was a shattered barn, maps soaked through with rainwater, radios hissing static. A young lieutenant, maybe 20, looked up as Reed entered. "Sir, we weren't told to expect reinforcements." "You weren't," Reed said. "Where do you need us?" The lieutenant hesitated. "Honestly, Captain, this sector's lost. The Krauts have tanks moving in from the north. We're pulling out by dawn." Reed nodded slowly. "Then we'll stay and cover you." The lieutenant blinked. "With them?" He looked past Reed, toward the line of broken figures standing in the mud. "With them," Reed repeated. The lieutenant didn't argue again. By dusk, the Broken Battalion had taken position along the outskirts of Saint-Vrain. What was once a small French village now lay in ruins. Roofs caved in, church steeples split like kindling. The only shelter was rubble. The smell of smoke and wet stone filled the air. Kovac, the one-eyed sniper, climbed what was left of a clock tower, his rifle wrapped in rags to muffle the shine. "Visibility's crap," he muttered. "I can't see more than 50 yards. "Then listen," Reed said. "They'll come when the rain stops." Below, Private Holbrook, blind, his eyes hidden behind cracked aviator goggles, set up a Browning machine gun by feel, tracing the barrel like a musician learning a new instrument. "I can hear the road," he said quietly. "Gravel, heavy treads." Reed nodded. "Good. You tell me before they see us." The night fell heavy. Fog rolled in, swallowing the fields. The men dug in, half in trenches, half in ruins. They didn't complain. For them, pain was background noise. When the first shell hit, nobody flinched. The ground shook, dirt sprayed, and the smell of cordite filled the air. Then another. And another. A German artillery battery somewhere beyond the ridge was zeroing in. "Stay down!" Reed shouted. "Wait for them to close!" Kovac peered through his scope, what was left of it. He could barely see shapes moving through the mist. Infantry? Maybe 2 platoons. And tanks. Jesus. Tigers. Reed's face was calm. Let them come. Minutes stretched like hours. The fog pulsed with movement. Then, faintly, the rumble began. The low, steady growl of engines. The Germans were coming down the main road, their armor leading, infantry following like shadows. Reed crouched beside Holbrook. "You hear them?" "Yes, sir," Holbrook said. 2 tanks, maybe 3. Closest one's right. He paused, tilted his head, listening to the pattern of metal. "No, 4. One's limping, left tread damaged." "Good," Reed said. "That's the one we hit first." He turned to Keller, the one-armed sergeant with the homemade reload rig. "Can you get that bazooka up?" Keller grinned, his teeth catching the flash of lightning. "You bet your hook I can." The battle began in a single roar. Keller fired the first shot, his arm brace clamped around the launcher's handle, his teeth biting down on the trigger wire. The rocket screamed through the fog and hit the lead tank dead on. Fire bloomed. The explosion lit the night like sunrise. "Now!" Reed shouted. "Light them up!" The ridge erupted. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, a storm of noise and flame. The Germans staggered, then fired back. Their tracers cut the air in red and white streaks. One shell slammed into the wall beside Kovacs's tower, sending bricks cascading into the street. He coughed dust, steadied his rifle, and fired through the smoke. A German officer dropped. Holbrook's gun chattered non-stop. He aimed by sound, sweeping fire across the road in rhythmic bursts. Every time Reed shouted, "Left!" or "Short!" he adjusted, never missing twice. Ellis, the mute, crawled through the trenches, relaying orders with taps and gestures. To the others, it looked like chaos, but to them, it was music. Each man reading the other's rhythm, fighting as one. A grenade landed near Mason, the burned man with no ears. He saw it, didn't hear it. Kovacs shouted a warning, too late. Mason turned, saw the light, and threw himself over it. The blast lifted him, tore him apart, but saved the 2 men beside him. Reed didn't stop. He couldn't. "Hold the line!" he yelled. The tanks pressed forward. Another shell hit the trench. Keller was thrown clear, his shoulder bleeding where the harness snapped. He laughed through the blood. "Still here, sir!" "Then keep shooting!" Reed shouted back. For hours, they fought like that. Blind firing for the deaf. Deaf watching for the blind. The mute leading the ones who could no longer hear commands. Every man filled another's missing piece. By midnight, the road was littered with burning metal and bodies. The Germans fell back, regrouping in the fog. The Broken Battalion stayed where they were, smoke curling from their rifles, faces slick with rain and blood. Kovacs climbed down from the tower, limping hard. "That's one wave," he said. "They'll be back." Reed nodded, wiping soot from his cheek. "Good. We're still here." He looked around at what was left of his men. 9 now, maybe 10 still breathing. In the flicker of firelight, they looked less like soldiers and more like survivors of some ancient myth. Burned, bent, unkillable. And in that moment, Reed realized something. They were no longer fighting for the army. They were fighting in spite of it. The fog thickened until the world became nothing but noise and pulse. The rain stopped, but the mist clung to the trees, to the ruins, to the broken bodies half buried in mud. It was just past midnight when the Germans came again. Quieter this time, slower, like predators learning from the first mistake. Reed crouched beside the ruined church wall, listening. His hearing wasn't what it used to be. The blast that took his arm had left a permanent ring in his right ear. But even through the hum, he could sense it. The sound of boots, deliberate and cautious. Metal on stone. The whisper of breath. He turned to Sergeant Kovac, the one-eyed sniper kneeling beside him. "They're flanking. East side." Kovac nodded. "I'll cover." He started to climb back up the half-collapsed bell tower, but Reed grabbed his sleeve. "Don't. They'll shell it again." Kovac grinned through bloodied teeth. "Then they'll waste a shell." He limped away before Reed could stop him. The rest of the men were ghosts now, faces smeared with soot, eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Their uniforms were torn beyond recognition. Some were barefoot. Some didn't even have helmets. To anyone looking from afar, they looked less like soldiers than revenants, the dead who refused to lie down. Corporal Ellis, the mute, was drawing symbols in the dirt, hand signals for the ambush. Reed watched him, then nodded. The plan was simple. Stay silent, wait for the enemy to come close, then tear them apart in the dark. No shouting, no lights, no fear. The first German patrol appeared through the fog like shadows. 5 men moving in a crouch, rifles ready. They didn't see the figures crouched among the rubble. They didn't notice the glint of a steel hook, or the faint reflection in a single remaining eye. Reed waited until the first German stepped into the open. Then he gave a small signal, a tap of his hook against a stone. The night erupted in silence. Holbrook, the blind gunner, fired 3 short bursts, each one perfect. The first 2 Germans dropped before they even screamed. The third stumbled, spinning toward the sound. Keller, the one-armed bazooka man, swung his rifle like a club and broke his neck. Ellis moved like a ghost between them, knife flashing in and out of the fog. He didn't make a sound. Couldn't. But his movements were precise. Surgical. He caught a soldier from behind, covered his mouth, and ended it with a quick twist. The Germans tried to regroup, but confusion spread faster than orders. To them it felt like the dead had risen. Gunfire without muzzle flashes, voices without words, movement without noise. Panic began to ripple through their ranks. "Geister!" one of them shouted. Ghosts. Reed heard it, and for a brief moment he almost smiled. He raised his pistol and fired once, the sound cracking like thunder in the stillness. Then his men moved as one, their signal to attack. They came from the ruins, from the mud, from holes in the ground. The blind fired by echo, the deaf moved by vibration. The limbless fought from where they lay, firing mounted guns they could no longer carry. The Germans fired wildly into the fog. Bullets cut through smoke, hitting walls, trees, nothing. Every flash of light only blinded them more, and in that confusion, the Broken Battalion struck, again and again. Kovac, from his perch in the shattered bell tower, picked off officers one by one. He didn't bother aiming for the chest. He went for the throat. His shots were slow, methodical, deliberate. Between each, he whispered to himself, "Still alive." Down below, Keller reloaded his rifle using his teeth. His shoulder was bleeding badly now, the harness torn, but he kept shooting. Every time he pulled the trigger, the recoil slammed into the wound, but he didn't stop. Private Mason, the man with no ears, crawled through the mud, dragging a belt of grenades. He couldn't hear the Germans shouting behind him. He just felt the vibration in the ground, the tremor of footsteps, and pulled the pin. The explosion lit the field like a heartbeat of hell. Reed moved between positions, shouting orders that half his men couldn't hear and the rest didn't need. They moved on instinct now, a living organism stitched together from pain and purpose. By 2 a.m., the battle had dissolved into chaos. Bodies lay scattered in the ruins. Smoke poured through the fog, turning everything gray. Kovac's tower finally gave way. A shell hit the base, sending the whole structure collapsing in slow motion. Reed turned just in time to see it fall. For a second, he thought the sniper was gone. Then he saw movement in the dust. Kovac dragged himself free, coughing blood, one leg twisted at an impossible angle. He crawled to his rifle, pulled it into his lap, and kept firing. When dawn came, the fog began to lift. What it revealed was beyond comprehension. The Germans were gone. What was left of them retreated north, leaving behind charred armor and mangled bodies. The road to Saint-Vrain was still held. Reed limped through the ruins, the hook on his arm slick with blood. His or someone else's, he couldn't tell. He counted heads. 8. 8 left alive. Holbrook sat by his gun, eyes closed, whispering softly. Still hear them. Far off. They're not coming back, Reed said. Holbrook smiled. Good. Maybe they learned something. Ellis crouched beside him, signing something in the dirt. We held. Reed nodded. We held. Kovac, propped against a wall, looked up at the rising sun. You think they'll even believe this happened? Reed's answer was quiet. Doesn't matter if they believe. We were here. He looked out over the field, where fog still clung to the burned wrecks like shrouds. It looked like a graveyard. Their graveyard. Somewhere, a church bell that hadn't rung in years creaked in the wind, hanging by a thread. The sound was faint, ghostly, almost human. And in that strange light, among ruins and smoke, the Broken Battalion stood together. Men who had already died once, and would die again if needed. To the Germans who survived, they would forever be remembered as Die Toten Männer, the dead men. To the Americans, they would never be remembered at all. By morning, the mist had thinned, and what remained of Saint-Vrain looked less like a village and more like the skeleton of one. Walls shattered, roofs torn away, smoke curling from chimneys that no longer belonged to houses. The Germans had pulled back during the night, but Reed knew what that meant. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. He gathered what was left of his men. 8 ghosts in torn uniforms, faces grey with exhaustion and ash. Kovac was pale, his right leg splintered with a rifle stock and a torn sleeve. Holbrook sat beside the machine gun he could no longer lift, his fingers trembling but steady on the trigger. Ellis, the mute, moved silently between them, checking ammunition, tapping shoulders, nodding once to Reed. No one spoke. They didn't need to. At 10 a.m., the sound came. Faint at first, then swelling until it drowned the wind. Engines. Dozens of them. Reed climbed onto the wreckage of a tank and peered through his binoculars. Down the valley road, German armor advanced in a straight line. Panzers, half-tracks, infantry trucks. The sky above them buzzed with reconnaissance planes. They're bringing everything, Kovac muttered. Reed jumped down, mud splashing his boots. "Good," he said. "So are we." He wasn't joking. In the night, they'd scavenged whatever they could. Captured Panzerfausts, grenades, mines, fuel cans turned into bombs. They'd even repaired one of the destroyed American Shermans, wiring it to fire manually. It wasn't strategy. It was defiance. Reed paced in front of his men, his hook glinting in the light. "This is it," he said. "No more fallback, no more orders. The line stops here. They think we're broken. Let's show them what broken can do." Kovac gave a ragged laugh. "You're starting to sound like a preacher, Captain." Reed looked at him. "Then pray." At 10:17, the first shell hit the town square. Stone shattered. Dust filled the air. Another followed, closer. The ground shook under the weight of incoming armor. The deaf soldier, Hughes, felt the vibrations first and raised his hand. "Now!" Reed shouted. Holbrook opened fire. The Browning chattered to life, cutting down infantry spilling from the half-tracks. The one-armed Keller hurled Molotovs from a second-story window, flames spreading through the street like veins of fire. Mason, his body still bandaged from burns, dragged himself into position behind a Panzer wreck, feeding belts into the gun even as his arms blistered anew. The Germans advanced cautiously, uncertain of what they faced. The first Panzer to enter the village hit a mine, a trap Reed himself had buried hours earlier. The explosion flipped the tank onto its side, its turret spinning uselessly. Reed ran to Holbrook's position. "Keep them tight!" he yelled. Holbrook smiled faintly. "Don't worry, sir. I can hear them dying." Another shell landed close. Reed hit the ground hard. His ears rang, his vision blurred. When he stood, his right leg wouldn't move. He pulled himself upright using the wall and kept going. Kovac, from his perch in a ruined bell tower, was calling targets through gritted teeth. "Second Panzer, right tread, 300 yards. Keller swung the bazooka, braced it against his shoulder harness, bit down on the wire trigger. The shot hit true. The Panzer's turret blew open like a tin can. The cheer that followed wasn't loud, just a breath, a shared heartbeat between the living and the dying. Then came the counterfire. The Germans unleashed everything: artillery, mortars, machine guns. The church tower collapsed in flames. Kovac disappeared in the smoke. Reed screamed his name, but there was no answer. Ellis appeared beside him, face streaked with soot, gesturing fast. "Fall back. Reinforce south wall." Reed nodded. "Go." They moved through the ruins, dragging wounded, dodging shrapnel. The noise was constant. Steel screaming, men shouting, the thunder of tanks grinding over stone. The village itself seemed alive, breathing smoke and fire. At one corner, a half-track broke through the barricade. Reed turned, saw Keller limping toward it with a grenade clutched in his only hand. "Keller!" Reed shouted. "Get back!" Keller grinned. "I can't, sir. Somebody's got to finish this." He pulled the pin with his teeth and ran straight at the vehicle. The explosion tore through the street, throwing Reed backward. When he looked again, there was nothing left of Keller but fire and shrapnel, and a half-track burning bright enough to light the fog. Hours passed. The sky turned orange, then gray, then black again. One by one, the Broken Battalion fell. Holbrook bled out beside his gun, still muttering firing ranges under his breath. Mason collapsed behind the barricade, his charred hands fused to the weapon. Ellis, the mute, took a bullet to the chest while pulling Reed to safety. He didn't make a sound, just looked at Reed once and smiled before falling still. By dusk, there were 3 left. Reed, Kovac, somehow alive, crawling through the rubble, and Hughes, the deaf man. The last German push came at sunset. Infantry poured through the gaps, shouting, firing from the hip. Reed grabbed a captured MP-40 and opened fire until the magazine clicked empty. Kovac covered him from the church ruins. 1 eye, 1 rifle, 1 last round. When the gunfire finally stopped, Saint-Vrain was silent again. Smoke curled from what was left of the houses. The rain began to fall. Reed limped through the rubble, looking for survivors. "Report," he croaked. No answer. Only the sound of dripping water and crackling embers. He found Kovac sitting against a wall, his rifle across his lap. "We did it," the sniper whispered. "We held." Reed knelt beside him. "We held," he echoed. Kovac looked out toward the valley where the last of the German tanks were turning back. "Think anyone will remember?" Reed stared into the smoke. "No, but they'll feel it." That night, as darkness swallowed the battlefield, the last 3 men of the Broken Battalion sat among the ruins, surrounded by their dead and their victory. Above them, lightning split the sky, illuminating the wreckage of Saint-Vrain, a village held by men the world had already buried. And for the first time since the war began, Captain David Reed let himself believe that maybe the broken could win. It was spring 1958, 14 years after Saint-Vrain. The war was long over, the headlines long gone. America was busy looking toward the future: highways, television, rockets. The noise of peace had buried the silence of sacrifice. But in a dusty government basement in Washington, a clerk named Arthur Hale stumbled across a folder with no classification stamp. It was thin, just a few pages, yellowed by time. The first line read, "After Action Report, Unverified Engagement, Saint-Vrain Sector, November 1944. He turned the page. Attached were photographs, grainy, blurred, taken by reconnaissance aircraft days after the battle. The village was gone, replaced by blackened earth and wrecked armor. Dozens of enemy tanks lay scattered across the valley. There were no bodies visible, only the faint shapes of trenches and collapsed walls. At the bottom of the file, a handwritten note. No record of assigned U.S. unit. Possible irregular detachment. Survivors unconfirmed. Hale frowned. He'd never heard of a battle there. It wasn't in any manual, any official campaign history. He read the note again. Possible irregular detachment. Then another page, a list of names all crossed out in red pencil except one. Reed, David A. Beside it, a single word. Missing. That night, curiosity got the better of him. Hale began searching through archives, hospital records, unit rosters, discharge lists. He found fragments. A supply requisition signed by Captain D. Reed. A destroyed truck manifest marked Broken Battalion, provisional. And one requisition order labeled Training Equipment, Airfield Sector 12B, decommissioned. The deeper he looked, the more the pattern formed, like seeing the shadow of something too big to name. 3 weeks later, Hale tracked down the last name on the list, a nurse who had served in the convalescent hospital in southern England in 1944. Her name was Ellen Ward. When he mentioned Captain Reed, her eyes filled with memory. He used to visit the amputee ward, she said. Said he was checking morale. But really, he was building something. He said the army didn't need perfect men. It needed the ones who refused to quit. "Did you ever hear from him again?" Hale asked. She shook her head. "Only once. A postcard. No return address. It just said, 'They held the line.'" That phrase haunted Hale. He included it in his report, typed it neatly at the end. "They held the line." Then he filed the papers away, knowing nobody would ever read them. But sometimes legends don't die with paperwork. Years later, during the Korean War, an American tank crew near the Naktong River claimed they were saved by a unit of crippled infantry who appeared out of the fog one night. When the sun rose, the infantry was gone. Command dismissed it as confusion. In Vietnam, a Marine patrol caught in an ambush swore they saw silhouettes crawling through smoke, men dragging themselves across the ground, firing machine guns, faces half covered in bandages. Their radio operator called them the ones who don't fall. By the time of the Gulf War, the story had a name again. Among the ranks, whispered late at night, passed between the young and the terrified. It was called the battalion that wouldn't die. No one knew where it started. Some said it began in France. Others said in Africa or Italy. Some said they were ghosts. Others believed they were something else. A memory that refused to fade, made flesh again every time men bled and refused to surrender. There's an unmarked grave near the edge of Saint-Vrain now. Locals say the Americans never came back for their dead. But every few years, flowers appear there anyway. White lilies, always fresh. No one knows who leaves them. And if you stand there at dawn, when the fog rolls down from the hills and the sun hasn't yet touched the ruins, you can hear it. Faint but certain. The metallic rhythm of boots dragging through mud. The whisper of a man with half a voice giving quiet orders. The slow, steady breath of those who never stopped fighting. No one sees them, but every soldier who passes through that valley swears the same thing. They feel watched, protected. Captain David Reed was never found. His name remains absent from the official record, his medals unissued, his rank unrecognized. But on an old stone wall in the Saint-Vrain cemetery, someone carved a message, barely visible now beneath moss and rain. For those who were never whole, but made the world whole again. It isn't signed. It doesn't need to be. Because maybe that's the point. They were never fighting for recognition or medals or country. They fought because even broken men can stand between the world and the darkness. And sometimes, that's enough. The Broken Battalion never asked for remembrance. But the earth remembers. The wind remembers. And every soldier who's ever been left behind hears them still. The men who were never whole and never needed to be.